If you don't need the explanation on this section, skip straight to the section 2. So, what was the first and the second stages, you may ask? First stage lasted since February 24th till the first days of April. It was a battle for the north, Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy and Zhytomyr regions. This battle ended with humiliating defeat of Russian forces and their goodwill gesture. The second stage was the Battle of Donbass. After defeat in the north, Russia moved all the forces it had left to Donbass, the east of Ukraine, namely the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and south, Kherson, Mykolaiv and Zaporizhia, with the focus on Donbass. The most active phase of Battle for Donbass has ended as for today. Russians have gained minor territorial gains in the region, while Ukrainian forces made a tactical relocation and prepared for a counteroffensive there. Meanwhile, at the part of the temporarily occupied south, Ukraine has already started a counteroffensive, proceeding towards liberation of Kherson and also counterattacking in Mykolaiv and Zaporizhia regions. The current balance of power. Personnel. At the beginning of the war, Russia had around 250,000 soldiers, while Ukraine had around 200,000 soldiers. Having lost over 40,000 soldiers at least dead, and at least 1.5 of that as injured, Russia now has from 100,000 to 150,000 in total, calculated with both estimated Russian killed-injured losses and the reserves moved into Ukraine. While Ukraine, which personnel losses are 3 to 5 times shorter compared to Russian ones, and which gained insane amount of enlisted soldiers willing to protect their country, has up to 300,000 soldiers in armed forces only, while there are also up to 200,000 soldiers in territorial defense, as well as 12,000 soldiers of National Guard, guerrilla in the places, and so on. Due to terribly corrupt logistics, huge losses between high-ranked officer ranks, as well as humongous amount of killed and injured. And lastly, daily growing levels of Ukrainian resistance inside the occupied settlements. The motivation difference between Ukrainian and Russian forces, as for now, is abysmal. By the way, if you want to understand the Ukrainian strategy in this matter of war better, and ready to spend 3 to 5 minutes of extra reading, I highly recommend you this Twitter thread. It is linked down below in video description. Armored vehicles. Russia lost up to 5,000 tanks and APCs destroyed or captured by now, while Ukraine losses are heavily outweighed by supplies from allies and captured Russian vehicles. As for now, inside Ukrainian territory, Ukraine actually has more combat-ready tanks and APCs than Russia. Aircraft. Russia still has at least 5-to-1 ratio compared to Ukrainian air fleet, but its losses inside Ukrainian airspace are so disastrous by now, at least 410 fighter jets and helicopters together, that as for today, Russian aviation is simply afraid of entering deeper into Ukrainian airspace, mostly only launching the cruise missiles from the inside of Russian territory or the border area. Artillery. Here, Russia also still handles the overwhelming numeric advantage, up to 7-to-1 ratio, but it's not as simple here. While the numerical advantage allows Russians to proceed with the so-called scorched earth tactics, leveling Ukrainian settlements to zero and trying to do carpet shedding of Ukrainian armed forces, it is far from being the same effective as it was just a month ago. The quality above quantity advantage of Ukrainian forces that came with the arrival of NATO artillery and MLRS systems that heavily outrange all the existing Russian artillery allowed Ukraine to severely cripple the Russian ammo dumps and command bases. Only in the last 2 weeks or so, HIMARSs allowed Ukraine to destroy around 50 Russian ammo dumps. And here's the thing about artillery. It can't shoot just with the same spirit alone. You can have even 50-to-1 barrel ratio, but if you won't have enough ammunition for it, it will be just a worthless junk. The expert precision is another feature of NATO artillery. If you will compare the daily losses of Russian invaders, something around just a month ago and today, you will clearly see that it started to lose more artillery units than tanks on daily basis. Slowly but surely, UF is chewing the last real Russian advantage like a long but soft stick of sausage. Since the last week of July, it could be seen that Russia moves large amount of weapons, tanks, APCs, artillery pieces, engineering vehicles, etc., to the Kherson region and especially to the city of Kherson itself, which it still controls. And this decision will be the last nail into the Russian coffin at the south, as well as incoming final in Battle of Donbass. How so? As you can wisely guess, nothing at war is limitless, be it personnel or heavy weapons. If Russia is sending reinforcements to Kherson now, it deducts them from somewhere else, namely and mostly from the Donbass region. But the reality of power balance at this point is such that it will only delay the inevitable for Russia. And it will either retreat from the south with humiliation and with what will be left of its forces, or simply decide to stay till the last man and lose most of its forces completely. Liberation of the Kherson region will come just a couple of weeks later from what Ukrainian command planned initially. If that's so much futile, why Russia is doing so, you may ask. Kherson is occupied since the first days of war, and the south in general is super important to Russia as it opens the land corridor to occupied Crimea, the steady supply of drinking water and the ability to move weapons and troops freely without the need of Crimean Bridge. Inside Russia, the approval of fascist masses is strongly built around the success of this special military operation and nationalistic narratives. The Russian state media engraved this "Russia came to Kherson forever" so strongly and deeply in those zombies' heads that the Putin's regime simply became a hostage of its own propaganda. And while it would be rational to order a retreat from Kherson region already now, to save forces for the final part in the Battle of Donbass, he simply cannot do this anymore, because it will cause a huge backlash from the Russians all around the country, and further dismorale of Russian soldiers who are already shooting their own legs just to get out from the battlefield. And so Russia sends more troops and more vehicles to Kherson, most of which will be destroyed in the end anyway, but in return, Russian positions in Donbass will become weaker. Now the Donbass. If you will read the Russian propaganda narratives, you will see shouts about victories and liberation of the Luhansk region. It would be good if the facts would not exist. And the facts are next. First of all, around 60% of Luhansk region was already occupied for 7 years straight since the 2014. So in 5 months of a full-scale war, in a region where Russia spearheaded all it has left, it was barely able to occupy 38%, yep, 38, not 40, of the region that's bordering Russia itself, so their logistics is much better there. Secondly, the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which were last 2 major bastions of Ukrainian armed forces in the region, and which Ukrainian forces left in the beginning of July 3 weeks ago, served close to zero strategic profit to Russia. Ukrainian forces still can move troops and supplies between the Kharkiv region, the center of Ukraine, and the Donetsk region, all the same. Not even mentioning that after the Russian scorched earth tactics, the cities themselves became just rubble. But there is more. After Ukraine armed forces left Lysychansk, around just 2% of Luhansk region, namely around 15 kilometers, that's around 9.5 miles, of land and just a few small villages remained under Ukraine control. Reality is that 3 weeks after, Russia was not able to proceed any further in the area. Yes, after already controlling 98% of the region, it wasn't able to finish the puny 15 kilometers of this marathon. So much exhausted it is. Meanwhile, UAF have the steady positions in the near bastions in Donetsk and Kharkiv regions, blowing up Russian armor depots every day and keep receiving more and more weapons from the allies, while Russian troops' morale keeps going down together with the amount of ammunition and still alive generals. Now, how exactly this stage of war will go? It will be decisive for Ukraine and probably the most bloody, compared with the first 2 stages. Yet bloody mostly not for Ukrainian soldiers, but for the civilians. There is a clear and direct link between the Russian losses and the terrorist attacks. The more Russia keeps getting its ass whooped on the battlefield, the more missiles it launches at Ukrainian cities, blowing up houses, trading centers, and bus stops, deliberately targeting the places of mass gathering to kill as many Ukrainians as possible. It looks atrocious and irrational for any civilized person, but for Russia, the fascist nation that simply doesn't know any other way to achieve what it wants, the terror is a logical answer to a situation where Russia gets beaten in only it cherishes and values so much the brute force. Rolling back to the events of the last months, you can see a clear increase of Russian terrorist attacks in parallel with the start of the effective usage of the HIMARS rockets by Ukraine and the mass destruction of Russian ammo dumps and command bases. Russia is your classic middle school bully. He only beats those whom he sees weaker, but when gets punched in the teeth, he falls down on his butt and cries in the corner, threatening you with a prosecutor father that will clearly jail you soon for daring to punch him. Russia is your alcoholic abusive husband that beats his wife for years, and when the wife finally defends herself, crying and furious, he starts to beat their dog instead. A dog that just can't fight back. Swap the threats of the prosecutor father to nuclear threats of Russia and beating of those who can't fight back to attacking Ukrainian civilians, and the parallel will become striking. But we all know what's actually real. After being punched, the bully can only cry, but to punch him is the only way to stop him from bullying. So here's the thing you should know. There will be more terror from Russia towards Ukrainian civilians. There will be more slaughtered prisoners of war. There absolutely will be more nuclear threats and threats to invade some other European countries, etc. But the more terror Russia will do, the louder its propaganda will become. You must simply remember the next. It means it smells defeat coming closer and closer. Back in the beginning of March, just a few days into a full-scale invasion, I made a few predictions that Kharkiv will not fall and that it will push invaders back, that all northern regions will be liberated fast, and that both southern and Donbas regions will be Ukrainian again. Back then, even my friends mostly just sadly laughed at me. But here we are now, 4 regions fully liberated, 3 more incoming, and Russia lost several more times soldiers and equipment that it lost in all its military operations since the World War II. This, by the way, includes 15 ships and 1 cruiser costing almost $1 billion to a country that does not have fleet to begin with. So here is the prediction for the third stage of war. Next 4 to 7 weeks will be decisive for it. Sadly, they will be also bloody for Ukrainian army, as Russia, being a hostage of its own propaganda, most likely will stand until the last man in the Kherson region. It will be even more bloody for Ukrainian civilians. As smelling defeat, Russia will increase the number of terror bombing even further. Yet, this will not change the result. The Kherson region liberation will take more time than Ukraine planned initially, but in the end, both Kherson and Zaporizhia regions will be liberated completely. Russia will suffer a catastrophic losses in both personnel and equipment. Already after this stage, Russian positions at Donbas will become much weaker than they could be if Russia would retreat from Kherson in time, which will bring the full-scale Ukrainian counteroffensive at Donbas closer in time in return. The third stage of Russian-Ukrainian war will end in the defeat of Russia at the south of Ukraine and inevitable liberation of the occupied part of the northern and northeastern parts of Kharkiv region. Thanks for watching, fellas, and don't forget to drop a sub and hit that bell button. That's extremely important for a developing channel like this one. Stay safe and stay happy. Ukrainian Sinner signing out.